They lived, traded, fought, and married the Cherokee. Millions of North Americans have Cherokee heritage because many mixed bloods passed for white or blended into African American families. This gets into some interesting history in mixed races. You've got the story of this happening in the 18th century with European settlers coming into contact with the Muskogee Creeks and merging with them, literally marrying them. But then there's also the Bronze Age angle, where there's speculation that Vikings might have crossed the Atlantic and mingled with the Cherokee and Creeks. This brings up the issue of timeline distortion. How do we reconcile these different periods and their impact on the Creek people? Or is this just a coincidence? Then there's the concept of identity crisis. These native inhabitants were literally gathered up and moved around the United States. That's what the Trail of Tears was all about. It wasn't just a physical relocation, it was a dislocation of identity, a severing of roots. You also had Native American orphan homes, which were part of this reprogramming effort. These institutions aimed to mold these new citizens into the white way of life, as if their original cultures were somehow inferior or savage. So is there more to this story? Well, let's talk about the Mandan tribe. These folks were something else. French explorers in the 1700s were the first to document them, and they were shocked. Why? Because the Mandan looked almost European. Fair skin, red or blonde hair, blue or gray eyes. Even their customs seemed more European than Native American. Lewis and Clark, when they met them in 1804, described them as half-white and extremely courteous and civilized. Now this led to all sorts of theories. Were they descendants of pre-Columbian explorers? Some thought they might be related to Welsh settlers from the 12th century. George Catlin, who lived with the Mandan in 1832, was convinced they had European roots. He noted their advanced techniques in manufacturing and their unique customs and traditions. Even the Mandan's own legends talk about a mysterious white man who taught them medicine and influenced their religion. In the 19th century, the Mandan are hit hard by smallpox and their numbers dwindled. They were eventually assimilated into other tribes. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Some believe that the Mandan were visited by Vikings. The first guy to make contact with them, Sieur de la Vérendrye, even found a rune stone with Nordic inscriptions near the village. Could it be that Vikings made it to America before Columbus? The Duhar, or the Duhair tribe, living near the Chicora in South Carolina and Georgia, were a unique group. Unlike other Native American tribes, they were Caucasian with red or brown hair, freckles, and gray eyes. They were also taller, and their men often sported mustaches and beards. Their way of life was equally intriguing. They herded domesticated deer, milked them, and made cheese. They even had corrals for these deers. Besides, they were skilled farmers and owned metal tools, which according to the official narrative was a rarity among Native Americans. Governed by a gigantic chief named Datha, the tribe lived in stone palaces and had a lifestyle that was a blend of Native American and European cultures. They were first documented by Spanish explorers Francisco Gordillo and Pedro de Coelho in 1521. These explorers found the Duhar to be an advanced society, even possessing pyrotechnic devices like sparklers and rockets. The tribe's Irish connection is a subject of debate among researchers. Their name, Duhair, translates into Gaelic to either place of the clan hair or place of the Irish. They also had practices similar to Gaelic tribes, like dairy deer farming, which is celebrated in Gaelic poetry. Remember this for later, these Duhar were also known as the Deer People. The Spaniards stated that the people of Duhar also raised domesticated dairy deer. The people of Duhar made the deer milk into cheese, Duhair, or actually Duheira, was the word used for Irish in the 12th century. The name of the Ossory clan members who fled to Leinster literally means deer people. Ireland had domesticated dairy deer for probably thousands of years. It only switched to dairy cattle after they were introduced by Norman monks in the 13th century. In 2006, a team of Native American scholars found that many Duhar words could be translated using Gaelic dictionaries, reigniting the debate about their origins. The Duhar weren't the only red-haired giants in America. As we discussed with tribes like the Mandan or even the Paiute even spoke of similar figures, adding yet another layer of mystery to the story of America's early inhabitants. Now this is where it gets interesting. Let us just consider that perhaps these mounds are covering up ruins of a previous civilization. There are connections between the Greeks and the ancient Celts or ancient Scythians. We've brought this up in previous videos. It's far too much to dissect right now, but this leads into the idea of Tartaria and that Athens was actually in America. Now hold on with me for a moment as we connect everything to that. But think about it. Why do you think it was called Athens? We'll dive into the founding of UGA and its classical aspirations later, but isn't it odd that there are multiple cities with the same name, each with its own peculiar backstory? What if this area in America was actually Rome, or more so the land of the ancients, inhabited by an advanced civilization? Did the Native Americans build brick structures? All roads lead to Rome, which interestingly is a city in Georgia as well. Well, it was called Rome, Georgia because that's the name the Cherokee called their land. Did the Cherokee consider themselves to be from Rome and descended from Romans? Recent DNA studies and linguistic evidence suggest that the Cherokee people might have East Mediterranean origins, specifically Greek. Inscriptions in caves overlooking the Redbird River in Kentucky display writing in both the Cherokee syllabary and Greek. Even more fascinating is the Possum Creek stone, discovered in Oklahoma, which can be read as Greek and suggests that the Cherokee syllabary was not an original invention, but derived from Greek. This lends credence to the idea that the original Cherokee had metal armor and weapons, and their DNA shows a mixture of East Mediterranean lineages. So could it be that the Cherokee Indians are, quite literally, the Greeks of Native America? There are researchers who have investigated whether the Romans, if we're to believe the mainstream narrative about them, actually attempted to cross the Americas in ancient times. Robert F. Marks discovered a Roman shipwreck off Brazil's coast, sparking an international controversy. The Roman government claimed this as evidence that Romans, not Brazilians, were the original discoverers of Brazil. As a result, searching for the over 100 known shipwrecks off Brazil's coast is now prohibited, and the sale of any Roman artifacts found in the country is punishable by imprisonment. So are we really trying to discover our true history, or is there a political motive to keep certain histories under wraps? So yeah, this gets super interesting because the natives in this area were mixed, some even having facial hair, which is not common to the typical Oriental Asian native mix that we typically associate with Native Americans. Well, let's talk about the Melungeons, a group that's been shrouded in mystery and folklore. They were primarily found in the mountains of Tennessee and trace their descent to two known Cherokees, one named Collins and the other Gibson. These families settled around the time Tennessee became a state in 1796. The term Melungeon was initially a derogatory term used for about 40 families along the Tennessee-Virginia border. Over time, it's evolved into a catch-all phrase for groups of mysterious mixed-race ancestry. These Melungeons were dark-skinned mountaineers residing in eastern Tennessee, southwest Virginia, and even into Kentucky. Some say they were descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, Others claim Turkish or Gypsy ancestry, and yet others believe they might have been from the lost colonies of Roanoke. Now, this was a very unique tribe containing Caucasian features with very dark skin, a mysterious mixed blood race. Typically, we're told that slaves were brought to America, but then why would they be mixing with the Native Americans to create these mixed bloodlines? Perhaps this ties into the story of the Sephardic Jews, who were among the first European colonists of the Southern Highlands. You see, the Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and many of them found their way into the New World. According to historical accounts, these Sephardic Jews were among the first to settle in the Southern Highlands, an area that includes parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, and yes, even Georgia. Now, what's fascinating is that these Sephardic Jews were known for their darker complexions. We've discussed this in previous videos, but these were likely the Moors from Spain. Now, typically the mainstream story is that Moors did not refer to black peoples, that it referred to a group of North African Berbers, but there are varying opinions on this matter, including a wealth of paintings, literature, and historical references describing the Moors and Sephardic Jews as pitch black. This would be a completely different story than the one we're told in schools. This actually gets into the subject of black nobility and the idea that some of the first settlers were actually black. Are the Melungeons connected to the Sephardic Jews? This question opens up an intriguing chapter in the history of the Southern Highlands, including Athens, Georgia. In 1824, traders found gold in what is now northern Georgia, a region that has been part of the Cherokee Nation. The mainstream belief or excuse is that the Cherokees were not evicted because of this gold discovery, and that they had already been removed from these gold-bearing lands 16 years prior to the Trail of Tears. But that seems like a facade to me, because it's the same thing with Rome, Georgia. In 1829, gold was discovered near Dahlonega, Georgia, starting the first gold rush in the United States. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, which fulfilled the Compact of 1802, was prompted by this gold discovery, as well as President Andrew Jackson's already stated strong support for removal. In 1831, Georgia's General Assembly quickly passed legislation claiming all Cherokee land in northwest Georgia, prior to their vacating it. This entire territory was called Cherokee County until additional legislation in 1832 divided the territory into the 9 counties that exist today. Also, the gold rush that followed led to the discovery of a village with European-style houses and mining tools dating back to the 1600s or late 1500s. This suggests that the area had been occupied by Europeans long before the Cherokees arrived. The Spanish, particularly Sephardic Jews who had fled Iberia, were likely one of the first European settlers in the Southern Highlands. These Sephardic Jews were involved in mining and international trade. They lived in the region until at least the early 18th century, as evidenced by the discovery of Spanish mines and the account of the Cherokee who reported seeing smelting furnaces in the Nacoochee Valley. Sequoyah, known for creating the Cherokee syllabary, had skills as a silversmith that he couldn't have learned from the Cherokees. His syllabary incorporated letters identical to those in medieval Georgian script, which was based on Jewish Aramaic script. This suggests that Sequoyah may have had Sephardic Jewish heritage. So what does all this information really signify? Essentially, the conventional narrative we've been fed about Native Americans is far from the complete picture. Entire communities were uprooted, and some mysterious tribes seem to have been conveniently omitted from history because they didn't align with the prevailing story. The Trail of Tears wasn't just some random act, it was clearly motivated by something valuable in the region. The regional inhabitants had to be displaced to make way for what was officially termed as the founding of a new civilized settlement. But is that the full extent of the story? Or is it merely a front? In Rome, Georgia, there's a historic museum named the Chieftain's Major Ridge Home, who is depicted as mixed and owned 223 acres on his plantation that contained numerous buildings and orchards, including many slaves. So the Cherokee had their own slaves in their own Roman-style mansions or palaces, apparently. Well, there is the Chief Van House, which was built by James Van, a Cherokee Indian leader and wealthy businessman who owned a vast 1,000-acre plantation, and in 1804, he completed the construction of a 2.5-story brick house. He was murdered in 1809, and his son inherited the mansion. So from this, we know that the Cherokee Indians could indeed build large brick structures. So essentially, the question is, were these early antebellum mansions stolen from the Cherokee during the Trail of Tears, or perhaps even transferred? The Cherokee may have been the first inheritors of these properties that then were passed on after the War of 1812. There is even evidence to suggest that the Cherokee were associated with Masonry, and they had several lodges. There's actually one in Rome, Georgia, from 1877, that features some very interesting architecture, one of the most prominent in Rome, yet there's little history on this building. Apparently there was a lodge before this and it burned down by General Sherman's troops. Many of the Union soldiers were Masons, and after realizing what they had done, they sent a large sum of money to rebuild the lodge that still survives to this day. We will discuss this later, but the lodge had over 7 feet of water flooding to the lower level during the flood of 1886. But it's not just the Cherokee. Freemasonry has a long history among the 5 tribes, including the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. This story is kind of strange, but apparently the leaders of the 5 tribes who were sovereign nations would travel to Washington, D.C. for treaty negotiations. They were of mixed descent and would become Freemasons during their visits to the capital. These lodges go back to 1848 with the Cherokee Lodge in Tahlequah. Why were the Native Americans drawn to Freemasonry? Some say it's because it resembled fraternal organizations that they were already familiar with. But what if we consider that it came directly from the first settlers? There is a reference of a fraternity of Indian blood brothers with a stone altar bearing these square and compasses as a familiar sight to Native Americans, which brought them to Freemasonry. However, the story goes that the 5 tribes saw Freemasonry as a connection that could help preserve their tribal existence. Conversions to Christianity were common among the 5 tribes in the 19th century. Chili McIntosh of the Creek Nation was ordained as a Baptist minister by Reverend H. F. Buckner, a Freemason in 1848. Chili's half-brother Daniel N. McIntosh, a member of Muskogee Lodge, also became a Baptist minister. The men who were either responsible for providing for the needs of the 5 tribes or who could provide legislative influence were often Freemasons. For the 5 tribes, it was the Masonic Lodge that could be turned to for schools, churches, relief agencies, and post offices. Is there a reason that Masonic history is not elaborated upon when it comes to Georgia history? They were responsible for most, if not all, buildings in many of the cities. Perhaps there's something else going on here. Interestingly, in 1861, Albert Pike, a well-known Freemason, was appointed commissioner to the Indian Territory by the Confederacy for the purpose of negotiating an alliance with the 5 tribes. Pike had become a Freemason in Western Lodge No. 2 of Little Rock, Arkansas in 1850. He was elected Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite in 1859. Pike, having represented the Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations in legal claims against the federal government, would personally make the Choctaw Peter Pitchlynn a 32nd degree Mason in 1860. Also, the Muskogee had their own lodges, and there also seems to be a connection to the Templars and the Muskogee, which in Oklahoma is the Muskogee Masonic Lodge Temple, which looks like an ancient Greek building. They have old ritual headgear, which also includes a tricorn Templar hat and a Shriner's hat. The state of Georgia's seal and flag features a Moorish Shriner Knight under an arch with 3 pillars, which is a clear nod to Freemasonry. This is the UGA arch, which we'll talk about in a bit, but this entire seal is Freemasonic in origin. And just to be clear, we aren't talking like your typical Illuminati narrative or anything like that. This is just history that's been lost or suppressed for some reason, but you'll find the same theme in many different cities. The original state seal of Georgia is a Freemasonic 3-pillar reference with a Shriner and his sword under the arch. The 3 pillars in Masonry are wisdom, strength, and beauty. The Georgia seal is wisdom, justice, moderation. Why does this matter? Because Freemasonry played a significant role in the history of Athens, Georgia. General James Edward Oglethorpe, one of the first founders and the first governor of the British colony of Georgia, was a Freemason. He helped establish the Solomon's Lodge in Savannah, one of the earliest Masonic lodges in North America. The lodge, founded in 1734, was later renamed Solomon Lodge in 1771. It's located in the Cotton Exchange Building, which interestingly has levels below the street, something we'll delve into.
Johnson, you're fired. Why? It's not you. It's your shirt. But it's Casual Friday. Well, you've
later. This building was essentially like an early stock exchange, strangely. The influence of Freemasonry extends to the University of Georgia, the first state-chartered institution of higher education in the US, which was largely established by Masons. Some might argue that Masonry is just a club or fraternity focused on public service, but that's just a surface-level understanding. Masonry claims ancient roots, linking back to previous orders like the Knights Templar and the Rosicrucians. It wasn't just a club anyone could join like in the modern day. It was an elite organization often made up of influential figures in society. The point is, Freemasonry had a deep impact on early Athens, shaping its history in ways that are often overlooked. Even the name Oglethorpe appears in the newspaper that covered the story of Skull Shoals with the mounds and the giant skeleton remains that seems to have been covered up, suggesting that Masons had control over the media and by extension, the history we're taught. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. It's a part of history that's been either lost or deliberately obscured. We left off discussing the 5 civilized tribes, their Masonic affiliations, and Sephardic Jewish connections. Now let's focus on what happened post-European contact in the Athens, Georgia area. The narrative often suggests that European arrival led to widespread disease, decimating native populations or what they label as the mound builders. But why were the Europeans so diseased? Was it their lifestyle or diet? Regardless, this wiped out large portions of the native populations throughout the Georgia Piedmont, so the story goes. When the settlers arrived, they didn't just pick random spots to live. There were already settlements, towns, and roads which influenced where they chose to settle. Interestingly, this area in Georgia is called Piedmont, similar to the Piedmont region in Italy near Rome. This Italian Piedmont was initially inhabited by Celtic Ligurian tribes and later by the Romans. The term Piedmont itself means foot of the mountain, possibly referring to areas of hills or mounds. This Italian Piedmont is rich in ancient Roman artifacts and ruins,